gonna run the meeting ever so slightly different than we have in the past. So we're gonna have our speaker give her talk, and then we're gonna preface our students to have the floor to be able to ask questions. And then if the students would like to bail, they can. And the rest of us will hang out here. We'll have a small panel discussion afterward for the community or any students that have more questions. But that way we can give an escape route for the students that have other things to do this evening. So that'll be kind of how our evening goes. I want to introduce Samantha Odegard. She is Dakota from Mni Sota Makoce, part of the ancestral homelands of Oceti Sakowin and the origin place of her people. Samantha is a member of the Ironheart Tiyospaye and citizen of the Upper Sioux Community near Granite Falls, Minnesota, where she has served as the Tribal Historic Preservation Officer and NAGPRA representative since 2017. Let's give a warm welcome to Samantha.
Thanks, everybody. I'm going to dive right in because I want to make sure that we have time for questions at the end. And thankfully, she already covered most of my little intro that I was going to do. But I'll touch on it a little bit more. So as she said, I'm from the Upper Sioux Community, and we refer to the place as Oceti Sakowin, the place they dig the yellow medicine, and ourselves as Oceti Sakowin, meaning the yellow medicine people, yellow medicine nation. If you know anything about Minnesota and Granite Falls is located in Yellow Medicine County, and we live at the confluence of the Minnesota and the Yellow Medicine rivers. I'm assuming you pick up on the theme. The location is named after the Dakota name for the place. And I have been the THPO officer in NAGPRA rep since 2017, and actually started in the department about a year before that in the field, and then took on these responsibilities shortly after that. So one of the things that they asked me to talk about was just NAGPRA in general. So, not NAGPRA, THPO. So I don't know how many people actually even heard of it or know what it is, but I will do as best of an overview as I can, while still maintaining a decent amount of detail. So, Tribal Historic Preservation Offices are a federal program under the National Historic Preservation Act. And it's an act that requires consideration of historic properties, and it established federal, state, and tribal historic preservation officers. Not that we enact it, but we're part of the process when it comes to considering those things during development and progress. And federally recognized tribes can enter into agreement with the National Park Service to take on the functions of a SHPO or State Historic Preservation Office, but on our tribal lands. I think one of the best definitions, like short definitions I ever came across for the National Historic Preservation Act, and the reason for it was it's responsible for helping to save places that matter. So back to THPOs. Although there are 574 recognized tribes at the moment, I believe, that could be wrong, there's only about 220 THPOs. So not every tribe has gone into that agreement with the National Park Service. And I say about 220 because the last count I had was 208, but that was from 2022, and I know of at least 9 more that have been added since then. And one of the things to keep in mind as we go further into this presentation, although the Preservation Act was put into law in 1966, the amendment that allowed for THPOs didn't come for another 30 years in 1996. So as I said, we take on responsibilities on the reservation. We have some off as well, but for the reservation, some of the things that at least Upper Sioux has taken on are like the survey of the land and identifying any cultural or historic sites and keeping an inventory of those, creating our own historic preservation plan. And we have to cooperate with others to ensure that these things are taken into consideration. On the reservation, that would be our other departments, just like any other nation or municipality. We have public works and housing and all those things. So it's our job on the reservation to ensure that when we're developing within our own lands, that we're taking these sites into consideration. We also do things like public education within our community, like I'm doing here. And we consult with federal agencies in accordance to Section 106. So what that means is there's a portion of the law that, well, outside the reservation, we consult on it. On the reservation, we're the ones that are responsible for making sure that it happens. And we do things like administer the grants and other stuff. The agreements, every tribe can be different, and every tribe can choose to take on some of those responsibilities or not. Those are the ones that Upper Sioux chose to take on. And I also add other duties as assigned. We are a tribal program, so we also take on anything else that our tribe feels is important. That can be a variety of things, and it can be like cultural centers. A lot of tribals I know also are involved with their cultural center, their collections, their archives. I am also in charge of our Dakota arts program and do a little bit with Dakota language. So as you'll see, there's a lot that we cover in this position. So off reservation, we also advise and assist governments on all levels, local to the federal level, in their historic preservation responsibilities. And one of the ways we do that is by reviewing projects that fall under Section 106, and I'll define that in a little bit. But that means we can do it anywhere within our homeland. So it's off reservation, but it's anywhere that our people had a connection or lived. And for Upper Sioux, that's about 2,800 to 3,000 projects per year that come into our office for review. So there's a lot. We also, again, provide public information, education, assist with training, and technical assistance on historic preservation. And again, other duties as assigned. So these are our federal responsibilities, but because we do this work anyway, when states or other places choose to enact their own requirements for tribal consultation, then by default, the THPOs are the ones they contact. And it's not necessarily just protecting sites from being developed or being destroyed. It's also consulting on their policies, on their collections, and overall approach to things. And sometimes, like I said, we're kind of a catch-all. So it's also that call that we get from someone that's like, hey, my grandpa collected this back on their farm like 70 years ago, and it's been in their basement for 30 years. Is it important? Do you want it? We answer those calls too. So I'd get into the Section 106 that I mentioned. What that is it's a part of the National Historic Preservation Act that lays out the process for consideration of historic properties. So again, it lays out a process. It doesn't mandate the protection of them. But it's for projects that have a federal nexus, meaning they're being done by a federal agency, they're using federal funds on federal or tribal land, or require federal permitting. That's what qualifies for official Section 106 consultation. And it calls for the consultation with all tribes that have an association with the project location, even if they don't have a THPO. So even though not even half of the tribes have it, they still get these same letters and could potentially get those thousands of letters or projects to review every year as well. One of the things that THPO also stands for is the Tribal Historic Preservation Officer. So that's the person that's designated to do the work under the Historic Preservation Act and sometimes under NAGPRA. We sometimes get double duty. And the important thing to remember is the THPO officer is designated by tribal resolution. That means our elected leadership appoints us, and we're authorized to represent the tribe and our leadership on matters of historic preservation. So that's generally the case. It's not all the case. You have to remember, with 574 different nations, people handle it differently. Sometimes consultation with the THPO doesn't fully meet their qualifications of government to government consultation. And that's important because there's a lot of times this question of what is consultation who has that authority. And that's laid out that way because we don't want someone to just be like, well, I called the receptionist at your tribe. That doesn't count as consultation. And it also means that we have the name, the person you can contact. You can't just take any tribal member and involve them on a project or hire them and say, well, I consulted with the tribe. It has to be what that tribe or who that tribe designates as the official contact. And we usually also end up managing all aspects of the department. Not always. Some THPOs might be under the Office of Environment or Cultural Resources, so they might not necessarily be the full director of the program, but in most of the cases, my colleagues and I, we're the director of a program or a department as well. So we're responsible for following the plan, for managing staff, if we're lucky enough to have them. Again, not all, some THPOs are just the one person. I'm lucky enough that I have like a THPO assistant and tribal cultural specialist that are helping me do this work. And yeah, so that's the slight difference. So those are responsibilities. So what exactly does a THPO do when we say we're doing that? The day-to-day comes down to the tribal consultation, which, as I mentioned before, is reviewing those projects. Those projects, a lot of times there might be a few pages. We can take a look at them based on what's going on, where it's located, say, no, we don't really have a concern. Other projects that we're reviewing, we're involved in for years. And if you printed off all the documents, you could fill a bookshelf. So it can really vary. And when projects like that are that important or that much of a risk to a site or an area, it is commitment. Sometimes I'm on a project right now. I think that's probably taken up almost a quarter of my time for one project. But as I said before, it's not just development, it's other things too. We can review and comment on and advocate for laws and policies on many different levels. Sometimes it's actually the laws themselves, like NAGPRA, or it's maybe a regional park is working, or in this case, under the federal nexus, a national park is working to update their plan, so they'll involve tribes, and it's our responsibility to comment on that. We also work as advisors and educators. Again, we inform the agencies and institutions and people about the laws themselves, how best to follow them, how exactly to do consultation in a meaningful way, and sometimes about our history and culture in general. And again, that's at all levels of government and all sizes of institutions. It can be back home, it could be the city of Granite Falls with just over 3,000 people, or it could be the United States military. For institutions, it could be the local county museum, or it could be the Smithsonian. We cover it all. And again, we assist with trainings and help with creating policy guides. A few of the states that I work in have like a tribal state relations training or a tribal summit. Minnesota actually just started what let's be a second year of the Cooperative Stewardship Summit. There we go. And that brings together all the state, federal, and tribal people that work within cultural resources within the state of Minnesota. So I help plan that and present at it. And we also sit on advisory boards and councils. Again, at all different levels. Some of my colleagues sit on NAGPRA or work with the Smithsonian. I sit on the advisory council for the Minnesota Historical Society and the Science Museum of Minnesota. We also do a bit of collections work. That can be either our own collections, which sometimes some tribes do that might have a full cultural center or museum. Some of us don't. I prefer not to collect things. I believe that our stuff shouldn't be on a shelf somewhere. It should be either reburied or back with the people that are going to use it for what it was meant to be used for. However, sometimes we still need to house things temporarily, or like we get things back and they haven't found a new home yet, so we take care of those. But also on the level with those institutions that I mentioned earlier, We will go and do viewings and evaluate their collections, identify and try to determine the significance of what they have, advocate for the return of most of it, and are the proper care of what they have while they have it. Another big portion of the work that we do is field work. As like I said, that's what I got started in when I started in this field. And how that starts sometimes is we start with a review, but part of that review can also be reviewing the archaeology or the work that's going to be done. So we want to make sure that it's appropriate and that it's up to snuff. I forgot the technical term, but sometimes, you know, we'll look at something and they said, oh, we reviewed this, we had archaeological work, we didn't find anything, and you find out they walk through it at like 50 feet apart for 5 minutes, and that's what we say, that's not adequate. And we do work with archaeologists in the field at a number of different levels. Sometimes we conduct our own field work. Some THPOs have an archaeologist on staff or one they contract with, and that at times has to be done even on the reservation because there needs to be that certain level to qualify for different things. But we also have a crew that does TCP surveys or surveys that are done by the tribe with a cultural focus. Some of my colleagues also do things like work in the field advocating for less invasive technology like geophysical, ground penetrating radar, magnetic resistance, stuff like that. We do tribal monitoring. That includes obviously the construction monitoring when there's ground disturbance, but also we count archaeology as ground disturbance. So sometimes we're out in the field technically monitoring the archaeologists. And unfortunately, we also do burial recovery. That it still happens regularly. So we've had to, luckily, my department has been able to focus that in certain areas, but some of my other colleagues have had to be on projects doing burial recovery for years. And as I said before, a lot of THPOs are also the NAGPRA representative. Some tribes have that responsibility given to somebody else, but if we serve as the NAGPRA rep, that's similar to the historic preservation, where we are advocating for it, enforcing it, and doing the daily work. But again, I want to remind everyone that all THPOs are different. We don't always focus on the same things, and we don't always have the same approaches, but we are always have that authority, and we are that official representation of our people in this line of work. I mentioned earlier about homelands. So as part of the Oceti Sakowin, what you guys know as Dakota, our homelands are massive. We're not saying that we're the only people ever to be in this area, but we went from the Great Lakes to the Rocky Mountains. I tend to focus more on that shaded pink area within Minnesota, Wisconsin, Iowa, North Dakota, South Dakota. But honestly, we've been so busy lately that the last year and a half has primarily been in Minnesota. So to recap, THPO's roles in cultural resource management, that we're basically involved on all levels, from policy advisor to collections management, from lawmaking to field work and education to enforcement. So some people might ask why we need THPOs, that if there's federal preservation officers, state preservation officers, can't they do it? And the answer is they were doing it, but they were doing it badly. Sometimes that was intentional, or sometimes unintentional. They just didn't know better. They didn't have the same perspective and understanding that we do. So the laws that I've mentioned here are actually a continuation, in my eyes, of the American Indian Civil Rights Movement. It started in the 60s, and so by 1978, you have the American Indian Religious Freedom Act, and you have the Indian Child Welfare Act. So our people focused on our identity and decriminalizing the practices that made us who we are, and the protection of our children that were still being taken away from our families. And then they fought for NAGPRA and inclusion in the Historic Preservation Act. NAGPRA was in 1990, and I believe the work leading up to the changes in the Preservation Act also started in 1990. But again, it's something that we fought for. We fought for the legal right to have a say in what was happening to our relatives and the culturally significant items that people were still collecting or digging up or keeping in institutions. So when I say that people were doing things wrong, the main things were that a lot of the fields that study us, they started at a time that they were being used to disassociate us from our lands and our places, and that had a total disregard for our way of life and who we are and our cultural practices, and a lot of it was dehumanizing. So examples of this, when I say this disassociation, there's a park, and I'm sure there's more than one, but one of the parks that this has thankfully recently changed, but they had a big sign that was known as Indian Mounds Park, and they talked about the mounds that were built there. But in that public sign, for anyone that comes through the read, it specifically said that these could not have been created by the Dakota people we know today, basically because we were too dumb and unsophisticated enough to create burial mounds. Although burial mounds are something that can be found almost all over the world, they purposely disconnected us from them to say that that was a more advanced people that came before, and these basically dirty savages killed them or chased them off. And that dehumanization, another example, one of the projects that I was consulting on was a mound group that had been used as a field school. So there was trenches dug through them. And I got that old ARC report from, I think that was done like in the 60s, maybe early 70s. And there's a whole rant in there from the head archaeologist from the university, not this one, it was a different one, that complained about how the American Indian movement was there to protest them digging into burial mounds. And basically said how, like, they're not going to know who they are or where they came from without this work that we're doing. Can't they see that we're doing it for them? So the caucasity of seeing that, when anything that we might have lost or anything that we did lose, it wasn't by our choice. Those were things that were forced on us. It was intentional. But then when you have the actual living people, the descendants of the ones that are buried in those burial mounds that are actively involved in the culture at that time, fighting for the Religious Freedom Act and saying that they're not going to know who they are unless we dig up their relatives, that's that dehumanization part. And that's why my relatives before me fought for the changes and for us to have a say in things now. But that's the one thing to pull away. If you think anything out of this of what a THPO is that we are the representation of a living culture and people. So when it comes to studying these things, we're not just from the past. We are here today, and some of the things that are still in institutions and museums are collected by people. Those are things that we could still be utilizing today, and we prefer to be. And we have a close tie with our ancestors. We don't have that distinction of like, oh, that was hundreds of years ago, thousands of years ago. That doesn't matter. That's still grandma. So, and I will say the laws aren't perfect. We were still having to fight for changes. NAGPRA changes just went into effect this year, but progress has been made on that. And again, they only allow for consultation, not control. Even though there are things, our burials, our relatives, we don't have this final say, but we're allowed to consult. So as I mentioned before, different THPOs might have different approaches. Some might lean more towards the archaeological and scientific, others more on the cultural and spiritual side, and everywhere in between. But again, that doesn't matter. We are all representations of the living culture, living people that are being affected by any of this work that's being done. Upper Sioux specifically, we lean more to the cultural and spiritual side. Part of it is that's my background. That's what I find is most important. That's what I came to this office being focused on and having some background in. But I also felt it was something needed in the field. No offense to archaeologists, but anyone can be an archaeologist. You can go to school, you can learn that. You can't learn to be Dakota if you're not, or indigenous of whatever tribe that's working on the project. And we focus on the identification of sites because a lot of them out there aren't, or even if they are identified as an archaeological site, that doesn't mean that's the real identification of what they are. And advocacy on all different levels, for the site protection, for the inclusion of this perspective and the work that's being done, for the return of sacred items and family, but also education like this. We were having a conversation earlier. I don't like public speaking. I don't feel comfortable doing this, but it's important. And I know a lot of you, especially your students, and if you're going into this field, there's things that I want you to know. So getting a little bit more into that cultural or spiritual approach. As I said before, we're a living culture. We are still doing a lot of the ceremonies and things that our ancestors did, even if they've have to been altered. And we have those strong ties that the center of our belief system is that relationship with all of our relatives, the ones today, in the past, and in the future. So that connection allows us to see things differently. So we can identify sites without digging. Archaeologists, other ones, they're looking for the things that are left behind, right? You're looking for what hasn't decomposed. But with traditional knowledge, we're able to go out to those same areas and we can find the sacred sites and things that have a more significant meaning. And a lot of times those sites aren't ones that have a lot of artifacts. Because if you think about it, if it's a sacred site where we pray or bury our dead, you're not going to find a bunch of fire pits or hearths and artifacts. But if they are there, we can identify them without having to dig into them first. As I said, even if it's done slowly with little brushes, it's still a disturbance, and we want to avoid that. And because of that, sometimes that also means we can do it faster. But it's also something that you need to remember is not a paint by numbers. We're not interchangeable. As Native nations, even if we come from the same area like the Great Plains and have some similarities, we're not all the same. Even within our own communities, even me and my staff, we have different levels of knowledge and different things. So we try to go out in a group as much as possible. Because if I'm out there as a Dakota woman and my colleague is out there as a father and a warrior, he's going to notice things in a different way than I do. So we train our staff to be able to at least say, hey, I think that's something. So you might see if you're working with us as we need to go back out there. First of all, we always want to be out in the field, but sometimes we can only get one or two people out there. And so we need to bring in someone else or a bigger crew or myself or one of our advisors to have a better interpretation of what that site is. And it also means that although because of the work I'm doing, because of my association with other tribes, I might know a little bit about Ojibwe or Cheyenne, but I would never expect to be able to identify a site that's not one of ours. So that's why I say we're not interchangeable. You can't just pick one Native person and say, oh, I had a Navajo out there, so we're good. It doesn't work that way. We do sometimes still rely on the science, the historic records, the archaeology to assist. Because especially like historic records, they might have documented something there that has long since been bulldozed over. Or even with archaeology, I can see an art report and I'm gonna look at it differently. If I start seeing certain types of pottery or certain stones or things popping up, that gives me a different idea of what's out there. And sometimes people aren't just willing to take my word for it, and they still want to be verified or proven. So we have the archaeologists out, but that's usually for the most part, it's to kind of ensure we're at the edge of something. So I'm going to fight to not say like, well, yeah, dig right there, you can prove it's a burial. No, that's a burial. You can go over here, check over here to make sure that there's nothing else there. And as I wrap this up, one of the most important things to point out is that although this work is very meaningful and it's powerful and I love the work I do, but it can also be very difficult. Because of that connection that I mentioned, it makes our reactions to things stronger. So when we see sacred items on shelves or our relatives still in boxes by the hundreds, I walked in the rooms and there's still hundreds of my ancestors' remains in there. That hits us differently. And it's something that we deal with regularly. So it becomes draining, it becomes difficult. And even when we're out on the site trying to identify things, there's always some level of disturbance. So whether since I mentioned mounds, I use them as an example. So we might go out on a roads project, they're expanding the road. There's a mound, like 4 mounds, they took out 3, one's still there. That's, even if we're able to protect that one, that still means 3 of them were already taken out decades ago. Or maybe all 4 of them are technically still there, but 2 of them have excavation pits in them, and the locals are using it for four-wheeler tracks. Even though there's signs posted, these are all true examples. Even though there's signs posted that say cemetery keep off, we still see fresh ATV tracks going over burial mounds. And again, that hits us in a way. I'm sure that speaking of this, I'm sure there's compassionate people and you've reacted to some of the things I've said, but it's different for us. And I actually started including some disclaimers on the bigger projects that our preference is always, in cases like this, at least mine, is that no action be taken. You don't need to build something there. If there's something already there, even if, like I said, that example of the 3 burial mounds taken out, that doesn't mean that's no longer a cemetery. That my preference would be take off the topsoil, return it to its natural state, and move your road. However, again, we consult, we don't necessarily have the final say, so that usually doesn't happen. So I started including that disclaimer that our involvement is only to be a voice and advocate for our ancestors and our sites. It doesn't mean we support a project. One of the other aspects of that is the tribal monitoring. One of the things that we hear a lot is, oh, well, we're going to have tribal monitors, it'll be okay. No, tribal monitoring is the last resort. It's that either that we've done what we can to identify and we just want to make sure that we didn't miss something. But when you're out there, and I speak from experience because that's where I started, I've been there. One of our biggest fears is finding something because that means we missed something when we were doing our survey. Or sometimes we do the monitoring because things have already gone through that mound route of those 4 with the 3 that are under the road. That likely means those remains are under that road and we're monitoring so that we can identify them and hopefully do a recovery. So again, although it's important for us to be there, we want to be there to advocate and do what we can. It is still extremely difficult. It's not just a job for us. It's much, much deeper than that. So on that note, I will wrap it up and say thank you. This is my email address. If anyone has any questions or wants to follow up on anything, you can reach me there. And I'll turn it back over to Casey.
We'll go ahead and open the floor for student questions.
I got one.
Yes, sir.
So when you started 7 or 8 years ago, you know, and you're new to the position compared to now, if you wanted to make a reading list, right, to educate yourself, yourself back then, what books would you recommend for yourself back then as a person starting out?
Honestly, it's not the books, it's the people. I was lucky enough to be able to have conversations with people that were part of that fight to do this work and that have done this work long before I even knew it was out there. But one of the things that someone else suggested recently is
And you're back.
Okay. I don't know if you're that, but anything by Vine Deloria Jr. Yes, ma'am.
So you mentioned the updates to NAGPRA in 2024. Could you talk a little bit more on that and how that's affected your position as an NAGPRA representative?
Yes, a lot more work, which is a good thing. It is a good thing. One of the things with NAGPRA is it was needed because there was loopholes and people still don't want to give our ancestors back, or they're just lazy about it. I'm very blunt, so I know not everyone's like that, but a lot of them, some of them are. So this has kind of pushed them into doing what they should have been doing 30 years ago. But that does mean that's an increase in not only the number of notice that we're getting for NAGPRA stuff, but also the questions. Because they're like, well, how do we do this? Especially the part where they have to consult with us before letting people do research or before they have things on display. So it really has increased the ability and the need to be able to balance both. So I almost want to find another person that's willing to do the NAGPRA work or some of the work with me. I don't want to give it up, but. Yeah. And one of the things hasn't changed, but now we have more of a platform, is the ones that are still kind of dragging their feet. It also means we have to confront them more and say, like, now you don't have an excuse. The law says you need to get this done now. So I get to get after people even more. Yes, sir.
Two quick questions.
Oh,
Area.
Yep.
Nations. Pro, I think. You know, how you word that?
What was your first question again? The project, right?
Yeah.
I can't go into too much detail about it, but I can just say it's a Department of Transportation project. A big one now going through an area. Luckily, I shouldn't say luckily, take that back. There is another tribe that's actually taking lead on it, so it's taking up more of that time. But there's been a lot of meetings and conversation stuff recently that's kind of monopolized at the moment. As far as working with other tribes, I mean, it's something that we have to do. It's part of the work. We recognize that. I won't lie and say that, you know, those old disputes and stuff don't come up. They do, but I think for the most part, we all understand the work that we're doing and the importance of it. So we do our best to work together and come to a consensus, or let someone else take the lead, especially if it's further away. But in a case like that, if we know that personally, again, we're all different, but personally, I'll still advocate that there needs to be Oceti Sakowin involvement. Like if it's Dakota or Lakota involvement, if there's any chance that it's one of ours, for that same reason, the fact that they're not us, so we need to at least have a say in that.
Students, do you have any other questions? And if not, we will let you step out and take a quick minute if you guys want to grab a cookie or a cup of coffee. We will put a panel together and everyone else will have another opportunity for their questions. We're just going to let the students step out. And we will, each guys feel free to move back up towards the front if you want to be able to chat with us a little bit more directly. But we'll take just a really quick, 1 minute break. Students, you're welcome to stay if you want. This is your opportunity to bounce if you want. Yeah. Grab it.
So on the assignment, it says the 2 to 4 paper, but then it says in the rubric the A is 3 to 4 pages. So the A.
That's right.
Yeah.
You
That's
can write a
clear.
2-page paper,
I know.
but do you want the A? Yep, you got it.